design or composition. Maybe I better keep an eye on the chat in case I make another mistake. The chat disappears when I share my screen, but sometimes it comes back. Okay, so these are the different elements of design or composition that artists use uh, to put works of art together, to sort of the considerations that they use. And the first one is in your book. It's this giant so-called silver slab, which actually looks black but sort of shiny to me. Yay, here's the chat. Okay. Um, and I think it's in the book because okay, it wasn't your computer acting up. It was me being spaced out. Okay. So, what I meant to say is that this is an example of minimalism, uh, which is a 20th century art movement that we're going to get to later, where there's not a whole lot going on. There's in this case there's one color, one shape, one scale, big, not a lot to look at. And this is the kind of art that sometimes makes people kind of mad, I feel like, because you go in an art gallery or a museum and there's this big black slab made out of plywood leaning against the wall, and you're like, what? And you're like, this is total BS. Okay, but it's in the book because um, it's so unified that it's kind of boring. Here's Cody. Okay, so let's look at an example of something that's kind of at the opposite end of the scale. So the opposite of unity is variety. Okay, so now we're looking at Rauschenberg's object that he called Gift for Apollo, which is kind of a jokey title. So Rauschenberg was an artist in the late 50s and early 60s, and really until he died pretty recently. So he had a long working life. But in the 50s and early 60s, his thing was to sort of roam around in New York City where he lived and find things on the street and put them together to make something else. And that's a type of art called move assemblage. Okay, so, and you probably know somebody who does this, who sort of collects junk and puts things together like this. So, if you clearly there's a lot more going on here than with John McCracken's thing. Let's see if we can go back to John McCracken. See, okay, here's John McCracken. Lots of unity. Now this has lots of variety, right? It's a whole bunch of stuff. Basically what it is. It's a door that he found, and he chopped the door off a little above the door handle and mounted it upside down. There's a chalkboard. Well, it tells you all the things here that are on it. Oil, pant fragments, somebody's pants, I guess. A necktie, we see that. Wood, fabric, newspaper, printed reproductions on wood, metal bucket, metal chain, doorknob, L brackets. These are these things, I think. Metal washer. Can't really see that. Oh, right there, maybe. Nails and rubber wheels with metal spokes. Okay, so he assembles all these things and he calls it Gift for Apollo. Okay, so to sort of understand the joke in the title, we have to look at another thing. Okay, this is the actual art history gift for Apollo. So this is a little Rauschenberg art history joke. So the real gift for Apollo, I don't know if you remember in the first lecture, or no, second lecture, I showed you a slide of this guy, the charioteer of Delphi over here, the bronze sculpture of an ideal male youth. It was originally part of a much larger sculpture that involved all of these things, these horses, this extra horse, this groom, this chariot, and it was an actual gift to Apollo by a wealthy Greek man whose charioteer won this race, and it was expected that if your charioteer won the race on the island of Delphi, that you should give a, a, a sculpture to the god Apollo. So Rauschenberg is kind of making, oops, a joke about that. So you can see that the bucket sort of corresponds to a horse, maybe. The thing on wheels here is sort of a chariot. And maybe the necktie sort of refers to a person like a charioteer. I don't know. Um, so the question for you as a critic or a writer about art would be, do you think there's too much variety here? Does it kind of cause the competition to fall apart? And if not, what is holding it together? Like, is there just too much stuff and none of it kind of matches? So, in discussions about this in the past, in previous lectures in person, people have pointed out that there is some unity here. The palette, that is, the colors that are used, are sort of gray and brown and black and so on. And go let in. And the fact that there's these wheels here that sort of echo the shape of the bucket, and the handle of the bucket, and the handle of the bucket, and then the chain sort of form a continuous line, you could say, here. And the colors in the bucket are sort of echoed here in this paint up here, and to some degree in this paint here. The green tie really stands out as something that doesn't really match anything else, but it does match the green bronze of the original gift for Apollo, so maybe we can forgive that little anomaly. Okay, so now in a minute so just keep this in mind, and now we're gonna look at something that really takes this idea of variety as opposed to unity about as far as it can go without making the whole thing fall apart. Okay. All right, so this is by contemporary sculptor Jessica Stockholder, who teaches sculpture at Yale. So she's a prominent artist, even though what we're looking at just looks like a pile of stuff that she just pulled out of her closet. Okay, bye, Sydney. So when I saw a Jessica Stockholder show when I lived in Houston, I went into a museum on the University of Houston campus, and I saw a bunch of these sculptures by Jessica Stockholder, and I thought, this is the worst art I've ever seen in my life. And it made me kind of mad because it was so messy, and it didn't seem to hang together or have any meaning at all. And I just left, and I went home and kind of ranted about it for a while. And then, but I went back the next day because this was a free museum and I could go in there every day if I wanted to. And then I thought, wait a minute, maybe it's supposed to be ugly, or maybe the whole point is that it takes the idea of a unified work of art and kind of pushes that as far away as it can without completely falling apart. And then the question arises, does it fall apart? It comes awful close to the cliff of falling apart. And so, when we look at something like this, we could all have a different opinion about whether it works or not. And that's something that would be a great thing for us to discuss on Friday at the discussion period. So if you're looking for something to write a discussion question about, this particular piece might be a good one because it always generates a lot of discussion. Okay, so I would make the case that in fact there are a few things, there is a lot of variety here, a lot of different colors that don't really go together, especially this green and the black don't look very good together. There's a lot of different materials. There's these sort of Nerf bullets or something glued to a gift bag. There's a frame. Is that a joke? A reference to art that gets framed? there's a little tangle of cords laying on the ground here. There's a rope over here. Somebody asked if this was part of it, and I don't think that. I think that's an HVAC vent in the gallery. It's probably not part of the art. And then there's this sort of plywood, or not plywood, but like a cutting board or butcher block piece of wood lying on the floor with a blue circle, and somehow that circle is attached to a tangle of colored plastic wire that's attached to this thing. Now let's just go back a minute. Okay, we have this, and then we have this. Now another question is this a reference to Rauschenberg's work? In other words, she didn't title it Another Gift for Apollo. But she almost could have, because it does seem to make a direct reference to this work from 40 years earlier by Rauschenberg. And similarly, it's an assemblage made out of, you could say, junk. So your question, if you were writing about this, let's say you went to an art exhibit and you saw something like this, your question would be, does this work as a work of art, or is there so much variety in color, materials, etc., that it doesn't work? And getting back to the Rauschenberg reference, I would say that there may be a reference to the bucket here in this blue circle, and to the chain here, and the fact that it's sort of a round thing pulling an upright thing is very similar to Rauschenberg's thing. But of course, it's even he sort of had a unified palette, and this doesn't. So yeah, I'm not going to exhaust the interpretations of this by talking about it anymore, because we may want to talk about it more on Friday. Okay, so another way that artists kind of make a work of art hang together is with what your book calls patterns, or which basically means just repeating a shape. So in this painting, the book points out, there are a lot of squares on the floor, tiles, which probably means the painter is using 1-point linear perspective, right? Which was about 150 years old at this point, or 200 years old, and all artists had to master 1-point linear perspective. And if you see tiles on the floor, well, probably. So the orthogonals, just to review, are these overhead lines and the floor lines, and the vanishing point seems to be somewhere around the center of this map. In other words, you don't have to be able to see the horizon line in a painting to find the vanishing point. The horizon is out the window. We can't see it. It's outside somewhere. But we know that if this wall were not there, the horizon would be here, and the vanishing point would be where the orthogonals converge, which is just about there. Okay, so the repetition of the squares on the floor, a painting here, a map here, the panes of glass here, and then these shutters that have been folded up to let light in, and the rectangular shape in the ceiling or in the fireplace mantle, and so on. Those sort of hold this together. There's a repetition of square shapes. Within this environment, rectilinear environment, you have these organic shapes of humans. I mean, humans are not rectilinear. We're not geometric shapes. We're sort of soft and round organic shapes. So I think there's a certain poignancy to that, the sort of organic shapes of the human versus the rectilinear shape of their interior. So this sort of shows you all the square shapes. Okay, so now we're going to talk about symmetry, and we're going to talk about balance. And so balance I'm typing in the chat now. Balance can be symmetrical or asymmetrical. Okay, so this is a drawing of the White House. This is the original design for the White House before it was built. And as you can see, symmetry means if you draw a line through the middle of something, it'll be the two sides will match perfectly. So you can see that if you drew a line through the center here, these two windows match. These windows have different kind of cornices on them, but they match, you know. And then even the chimneys match for the east wing and the west wing. I think the west wing is where the president hangs out, and the east wing is where the first lady hangs out. I read that yesterday. So I don't know which of these wings in this picture is east or west, but um, Donald is in one end and Melania is at the other. So there's also something weird in this drawing, which is this shape that when I first saw it, I thought, is that an alligator on the roof? But it's not an alligator. It's where the ink got a little bit smudged, I think, in the original drawing. Okay. All right. So here's the actual White House once it was built, you know. So you can see that, yes, it's very symmetrical. There's a flagpole right in the center. There's a fountain right in the center. And on each side of that, it's exactly the same. Now, why do architects like to make buildings that look symmetrical like that? One reason is that it makes it look stable, like it's not heavier on one end than it is on the other end, so it's going to stay there, which kind of is great for a government building because it implies, you know, your government is stable. At least that's what you hope. But not all works of art have symmetrical balance. In fact, it's actually more common for them to have asymmetrical balance. That means not symmetrical, but still balanced. Okay, so the trick with asymmetrical balance is analyzing how it works. Okay, so there are a couple of principles, especially in painting, that help to analyze this. One, well, first let's just talk about what this painting is and what it's about. So it's by one of the earliest Renaissance female painters, of which there are not many, but Lavinia Fontana is one. And she is taking on a famous Bible story that's in the world of art is called Noli Me Tangere, which I sometimes translate as "Don't touch my tangerine," but actually it means just don't touch me. Okay, so here's what the story is. So this is the 3 days after Jesus was buried in this tomb back here. So it's kind of like a comic book in the sense that first, this is the first frame. That is Mary Magdalene in the orange dress comes to the garden with the tomb, and there's an angel there who says, oh, the body is not here anymore. Jesus is not here anymore. And she kind of freaks out because she thinks it's been robbed or something. And she walks around the garden and she sees a gardener and she says, oh, do you know what happened to the body of Jesus? And it turned out that the gardener is Jesus. Okay, sort of disguised as the gardener. I don't know why. And he says, don't touch me because I'm not really a real person. I'm kind of between the worlds, as we would say. So this thing she's holding is a little lantern or candle or something, and you can see that he's holding a shovel and he's got a hat on like a gardener. Okay, so now that we've got that story out of the way, let's talk about how Fontana kind of makes this a balanced painting. So first of all, this big red or orange shape here, which is also pretty complex given all the folds in her cloth, carries a lot of weight because it's a warm color. Warm colors carry a lot of weight, and it's a complex and large shape. So if it were just there by itself and there were sort of nothing over here, it would not look balanced. So she creates the figure of Jesus here as a larger figure, even though he's not orange, so his clothes don't carry as much weight. Because he's bigger, it can balance the weight of this orange color. And plus he kind of merges with the sky here. There's a light color in the sky, which signifies that it's dawn, you know. So the fact that this, you could see this as kind of one shape here that balances this shape. But just in case this shape has now become have too much weight, not literal weight, but sort of visual weight, she places two complex figures, smaller figures, close to the edge of the frame here. So if something's close to the edge of a frame, that gives it more weight than in the middle somewhere. So there's a lot of sort of complicated checks and balances here that sort of create an overall balanced painting. Again, tells the same story of, but it doesn't look as much like an enclosed garden. And Jesus is just wearing a kind of sheet here. So the figure of, but he has a tool, a gardening tool, a sickle or a scythe. So Jesus is a fairly large standing figure here, and his figure kind of merges with the tree here to create one big shape here. So Titian's task is to somehow balance this big shape, overall shape here. And how does he do it? He creates, okay, this is a smaller shape here of Mary Magdalene, but again, he uses red. And once you use red, you've given a lot of weight to that shape. A red shape carries a lot of weight. And it's also a complex shape. There's a lot of folds, again, in her cloth. But just to make sure, he also balances the tree that's sort of leaning this way with the path that's going up here to this town. And then, it's almost like an afterthought, he goes, oh, wait a minute, there's kind of an empty space here. Okay, well, there's this leafy stuff up here, so I'll just put a bush down here. So, you know, I don't think a lot of these choices are conscious. Like, I think a lot of it's intuitive, and artists just kind of do what seems intuitively right. Maybe it's not a math problem or anything. Okay, so now here's another example of an artist trying to sort of push things about as far as they can go without it crashing to the ground. And in this case, Degas in the 19th century, late 19th century, it's almost like he's asking himself, can I make a really asymmetrical painting that crowds everything just about into one side of the picture and yet have it be balanced? That's the problem he sets by for himself. And he even, okay, the subject is these are jockeys getting ready for a horse race, and there's a series of posts that they sort of have to start behind, and one of the posts happens to be between you, the viewer, and the horses. It's almost like a snapshot, right? Photography was invented by this time, so it wasn't hard for Degas to imagine a kind of camera taking a picture like this, where there's a pole sort of off center and a horse with a jockey on one side and then a couple of other jockeys on the other side. So again, the question is, did he pull this off? Is this balanced? I mean, it's clearly asymmetrical if it is going to be balanced, but he's crowded an awful lot of stuff, visual sort of interest and action, into this part of the painting. And it makes you wonder if this part, which seems sort of empty, at least down here and up here, can make up for that. And so this is how he tries to balance it. For one thing, he puts two small horses on this side. There's a big horse over here, but two smaller horses over here. And there's actually some warm colors. There's a red hat, pink jacket, a sort of warm color in the sky. So those carry a lot of weight. This is a cooler sky over here, so it carries less weight. But then he also puts what we could call focal points on the left side. And that would be this sort of sun in the sky that's behind some clouds, so it's sort of not shining very brightly, but this, and one of the poles kind of points right at the sun. So I think his idea is if I can put these little things on this side, it'll outweigh this great big thing over here. And again, it's up to you to decide whether he achieved that or not. Okay, so now we're going to go back to this painting again to talk about a different principle of design, and that's, and I'll type it in the chat here, emphasis and subordination. So emphasis is obviously the thing in the picture that's being emphasized at the expense of other things, which are just sort of background or subordinated. That is, they're not as important. So Titian, didn't pull any punches here really. He very clearly emphasized the figures, the people in this painting. They're lit almost like with a light box in photography, so that the background kind of fades into the background, and that the story is about these two figures, and that the background is just there as a sort of supporting actor almost, because the colors and the lighting is such that you can tell this is where you're supposed to be mainly paying attention. And let's go back to this one for a minute to talk about another principle of design, which is directional forces. So I'll type that over here too. Okay, so your book helpfully created this little graphic that, or maybe this was just in the slides that I got. But anyway, the gaze of a human figure or an animal in a picture creates a directional force. In other words, the fact that this jockey is looking kind of in this direction, as is his horse, that creates a kind of line. But this line also connects points. Like it connects his hat to this hat, and then to the horizon line. And then there's another pole. If we went back to the painting, you could see it, but there's another pole here, and that pole draws your eye up to this other focal point, the sun. But then there's also a sort of implied line that goes from this point to down to here, allegedly. I don't know how you know that, but that's what this slide is implying. And then there's a lot of directional forces, that is, forces going this way, forces going up like this, forces going down like this on this pole, but it's all stabilized by the fact that there's a horizon line, a horizontal line, and a vertical line. So that a lot of compositions are stabilized by the sort of intersection of a horizontal line and a vertical line, as in this painting. So, because if there's too much directional forces, it can seem chaotic. Now we're going to analyze this print in some detail, and your book does a really, really good job of explaining how this little print works. So this is not a huge work of art by any means. It's a small etching about the size of a piece of notebook paper, but it's extremely carefully thought out. So the topic is a bullfight, obviously, and this is before photography, 1815. So it's kind of like sports photography, but in a print. So how did Goya achieve this? Okay, so it's based on, Goya was into bullfighting, which a lot of Spaniards are. And he wants, and I assume that this guy, Juanito Apinani, was a real guy. So he had the special trick of kind of pole vaulting over bulls. Now, I don't know why the bull is so small. I think 19th century cattle in general were not as big as modern cattle. So this is an action shot. Like, if you watch sports photographers work, they try to get dramatic shots, and this is a dramatic shot, but it's a drawing on a plate that was then printed. So there's a lot of movement, as there is in sports generally. All right, so the bullfighter seems to be vaulting from this side of the bull where he placed his pole to the other side of the bull, and he's going to land, on the other side of the bull on his feet. But his body seems to be kind of going this direction, and the bull is certainly running in that direction, or is fixing to go in that direction. His feet are sort of firmly planted, but his horns are headed that way, right? So there's a lot of movement to your right when you're looking at this. And so somehow Goya that's an important directional force. I'm going to write, I wrote that already. So somehow all this movement to the right has to be balanced by some sort of movement to the left, or some sort of stability. So first of all, Goya stabilizes the whole composition with, as I said before, horizontal lines like this and vertical lines. All right, so the horizontal line is the edge of the seating here in the stadium or bullfight ring. And then the vertical stabilizer is this pole that is miraculously exactly vertical. And not only that, but the bullfighter's hands are intersecting this line and this line, almost like, Goya was using craft paper or something to plot the points in an algebra problem. So that stabilizes things a lot. But there's other things going on. So let's go to the next slide. All right, so there's this strong diagonal line going to the right that's somewhat stabilized by the verticality of the pole. And then there's this other line allegedly that sort of traces the bull's feet, that creates a sort of triangle involving the bull's feet and the pole. So let's see if that's true. Okay, I think that there's some validity to that. And all of that, but the whole assemblage here of the bullfighter and the bull can be seen to create a triangle. A triangle is a very stabilizing shape in visual art. If you think back to the Titian painting and the Fontana painting, those also involved triangles where the figure of Jesus was one side of the triangle and the figure of Mary formed the other two sides. So the same thing here. So this side is kind of implied by the sight line of the bullfighter, but the triangle helps to stabilize the composition. But Goya also creates some movement to the left just with shadows. So he imagines the light coming from this side, casting the bull's shadow this way, and he imagines, let's go back to the actual print. He imagines that it's a hot, sunny day, maybe early afternoon, and that there are people gathered under kind of, these bullfighting rings had canopies over them, sort of shade cloths, you could say, around that, so that you could spectators could sit in the shade while they were watching the bullfight. And some people have brought umbrellas to create additional shade. So the crowd of people sort of clustered into this corner of the print in this sort of shadow area that nonetheless has some white highlights, kind of creates a weight on the upper left corner that balances this movement to the right. So let's go back to the diagram, see if you can see that. There's still a lot of space over here. This looks kind of empty, but because the bullfighter is headed into that space, it's a good thing. Okay, so again, you don't have to take this as gospel. You can read about it in your text or go over the lecture notes again in the PDF or in this video and decide for yourself. Does it work? Or is it too unbalanced? Okay, so now we're going to talk about something that I use a lot in fiber art, rhythm and repetition. And we sort of, did I spell that? We sort yeah, okay. We sort of talked about that when we were talking about that painting with all the square shapes and everything. So, one way that artists unify a work of art is by repeating the same shape, mass, or just the same object over and over, which is kind of what Donald Judd has done here. So, um, this work as a whole is called 15 Untitled Works in Concrete. Each concrete box is part of a group of concrete boxes, and there's 15 groupings of these boxes. And I'll show you a slab. I'll show you a shot in a minute that sort of shows that. But the boxes are all the same dimensions. They're all 2.5 meters by 2.5 meters by 5 meters. So they're all metric. And then the thickness of the concrete slab itself is 25 centimeters. So about like that. And he had these fabricated on site in Marfa, Texas, where they've been on exhibit there for the past 35 years at the Chinati Foundation. Now the Chinati Foundation. It was originally an army base an old deserted army base that Donald Judd bought to house his work. And this is really the first work that he created for this space. Okay, so here's, I think, sort of an aerial view before there were drones. I think this photograph must have been made by a person in an airplane. But you can see that he created different arrangements of these boxes. Sometimes there's 3 boxes, sometimes there's 6 boxes, sometimes just 2, but they're all, these 15 different arrangements of the boxes, no 2 arrangements are alike. So I've spent some time at this installation, I guess you could call it, in Marfa. And when I first read about it or saw some photos of it, I thought it was crazy. I thought, wait, how could that possibly be interesting? Just concrete boxes out in a pasture in West Texas. I just thought it was silly. But when I was actually there, I got it. I photographed it that day. These are not my photographs, and while photographing, I really started to understand it, and the meaning of it, I think, lies in the environment that it's in. It's this high desert in West Texas where there's only like 15 inches of rain a year, and the grass is kind of sparse and it's kind of brownish most of the time, and there's some pronghorns that live there, but it's a big empty space, and the sky is huge, seems huge because it's relatively flat there, and it's hot a lot of the time. So even in the fall when you're there, there's a desire to sort of get inside these boxes, to get in the shade, and you can do that. They're outside, no one tells you not to touch them. So they feel like shelter. They feel like a place you could almost live in them. Like you could camp out there. You could build a little fire inside one of these boxes. And not only that, they're not only shelters, they're frames. So some of them have 5 sides and only one side is open, but some have 4 sides so you can see straight through them. And I think the way they frame the landscape is part of the pleasure of viewing them. That is, as you move around, they frame other boxes and other things in the landscape, even animals that wander by. And so they're great fun to photograph and to just hang out at. And of course, during the different seasons, the way they look changes as well. This is wintertime when the trees are bare and the the grass is dead, and it's a different kind of feeling. And just the repetition of this one object, as Donald Judd would call it, a specific object. That was his idea for these. Donald Judd kind of rejected everything about Renaissance painting, you could say. Like if you think back to the Lavinia Fontana painting, Noli Me Tangere, and what I was saying about colors and shapes and complexity and balance, he would say, you don't need all that. You just need one shape, one material, one specific object. That's what he called them. And you repeat that over and over in different ways, and that has much more power than the illusion of three-dimensional space, because it's actual three dimensions. That was what he liked about sculpture. Okay. So here's another aerial view, and you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So there's 15 arrangements, you know, and then the cute little town of Marfa in the background, and the Chinati Mountains even further in the background. But basically they're just out in this field, you know. It's really, it's different. Okay, so I'm going to show you now a drawing. Donald Judd made a lot of drawings. These are the sort of preparatory drawings, it looks like, for number 7. Well, I don't know what number 8 is. For 9, 10, 11, and maybe 12. Or maybe, and then there's just kind of line drawing here to here. Maybe this ended up being like that. But he would work out these arrangements for the boxes on, you know, a yellow pad, not even a sketchbook, but just a yellow pad, before he hired the engineers and concrete experts to come build them on site. Another sort of example of the use of repetition and rhythm. And this is one that was in your book. I don't know if they've taken it out or not. But this is one of those Japanese screens that in old-fashioned Japanese houses are used to divide rooms. And the artist, so the screens are hinged, so there's 6 panels on this screen, usually made of rice paper. So it's ink, color, gold leaf, and silver leaf on rice paper. And the paper is mounted on wooden frames. They're fragile and beautiful. Okay, so this screen shows cranes, that is, you know, wading birds. Maybe you've seen a blue heron or something around here because we've got them. Or you've heard those cranes that fly overhead when they're migrating. And the artist has arranged them sort of like Donald Judd's boxes in different groupings that vary slightly, but it's the same shape and the same bird, same mass. Well, it's really a shape because it's two-dimensional, over and over. So first you have one bird kind of by himself, then 4 birds, then 2 birds, then 3 birds. And some of the birds, the way he varies it, you know, there's unity in that the same shape is repeated over and over. But there's also variety in the sense that some of the birds have their mouths open. This bird and this bird seem to be going, ah! Their tongues are visible. This bird's just kind of looking down, and this bird's really looking down. And then some of them have their left leg forward, and some have their right leg forward. But it's almost musical to me. Like, it looks like if it were a drum score, for example, a musical score for a drummer, it would look like that. I wasn't doing that to you. It's okay. So, I think some artists do think like that, like how to, and maybe Donald Judd did also when he was arranging the boxes. It was almost like arranging a certain rhythm, musical rhythm, as well as a visual rhythm. Okay, so now scale. And I think it's in your book, it's called Scale and Proportion. Oops. Okay, so again, this is one of those 20th century works of art that is at first maybe a little bit puzzling. But Claes Oldenburg and Koosje van Bruggen made a lot of these where they take a sort of ordinary, not very impressive consumer object sometimes, in this case a shuttlecock or a badminton birdie, and blow it up to monumental size, like 20 feet tall almost, and make it out of, well, in this case, let's see what it's made out of, aluminum and fiberglass reinforced plastic, and then mount it at a sort of scary angle so that it doesn't look all that stable. I mean, you just have to trust the people who installed it, right? That they drove some posts into the ground here and that these things are firmly attached so that when you're at this, the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City, and you walk up to this sculpture, you might be sort of intimidated by it and think, oh my God, is this thing just going to tip over and crush me? So, you know, the modest little badminton birdie of your youth has now been turned into this kind of terrifying object. It's kind of funny, and it kind of makes you think again about objects like this. So here's another one. Okay, so you're probably too young to know what this is. what this is a copy of, like a hugely blown up version of. But back in the day, before there were word processors and college students and other people had to type their manuscripts on a typewriter on paper, if you made a mistake, there was a special type of eraser for typewriters. And the red end here is the eraser part that you erased the mistake with. And then the blue part was the brush that you brushed away the little eraser bits with so that they wouldn't fall down and clog up the keys of your typewriter. So if you've ever seen a typewriter, you know what I'm talking about. But a lot of people have never seen a typewriter. I mean, nobody uses them anymore. But that's what it is. And in real life, it was maybe that big tops. But this one is really big. Doesn't tell you exactly. So as I was telling you before, when I was learning to be a photographer and I was taking photography courses in undergraduate and graduate school, most of the time nobody talked to me about these compositional devices that we've just been discussing, except for scale. And people did talk about scale. Like one of my teachers told me that having a little print, an 8x10 print, was just total BS, that no one would take a small print like that seriously. And at that point, I was making even smaller prints, like 4x5 contact prints. And those were considered really not good enough. And I really didn't believe them. I mean, at first I didn't have an enlarger, so I made contact prints. And eventually I got an enlarger and I could make 11x14 prints. And theoretically 16x20, but I never made any of those. Okay, but then something happened that made me realize that on one level they were kind of right, that scale is important and that size matters. So this was when I got a commission to photograph a prison outside of Houston, Texas, in Huntsville, Texas. Huntsville, Texas is a prison city, which may be hard to imagine, but basically the only industry in this little town of Huntsville, which is smaller than Cookeville a little bit, maybe about the size of Livingston or something. The only employer really and the only thing going on is prisons. And there are like 9 prisons in Huntsville, Texas, including the Walls Unit. And the Walls Unit is the oldest prison in Huntsville and one of the oldest prisons in Texas, if not the oldest. And it was around even during the so-called Texas War of Independence, when Texas fought the Mexican army to break off from Mexico. And allegedly Santa Anna, who was the Mexican leader of the Mexican army, allegedly he was imprisoned in the Walls unit. And they showed us the cell that they think Santa Anna was in. I don't know if that's true. Anyway, the Walls unit is literally 4 walls, really tall walls, like 30 feet tall. And at each corner, there's this thing called a picket at the top of the wall. And in the picket, it is this little house up there is a woman with a high-powered rifle. And so if anything goes down, as they say at the prison, in the prison yard, she just shoots into the yard. And so the guards that are in the yard and in the prison buildings aren't actually armed. They don't carry a gun. They carry a little cudgel kind of thing, and some pepper spray, but they're not armed. But these women in the guardhouses or pickets are armed. So I photographed this corner of the Walls unit and the picket house in 2006 for this project that I was doing with an architect about prison architecture. And I printed them originally at 11 by 14, so like this wide and this tall maybe. And, you know, I thought they were good prints. I didn't like the subject matter very much. It was pretty depressing, but, you know, I was getting paid to do it, so I did it. And then the architect said, hey, wait a minute. What if we had your negatives scanned and we had them printed out like really big, like 4 feet by 5 feet? And then we had an exhibit where all these giant pictures of the prison were exhibited. And I said, okay. So he got a grant for, I don't know, several $100s, and we did that. I scanned the negatives and sent the scans to a print place that had one of those really wide digital printers, and they printed them out digitally. I was doing traditional darkroom printing. And, you know, the print quality wasn't as good, but printing them at that scale was really a revelation to me, that it really does matter. It really does affect the way people see your photographs. And they were all in a room at the University of Houston together. And it was kind of overwhelming. It was really upsetting, I think, to people to be in a room with all these prints, including a photograph of the death chamber where people are executed. And it was going on a lot in Texas in 2006. They executed somebody on average about every 2 weeks. And when I photographed the execution room and the gurney in there, they had executed somebody the night before we were in there. So it was something that the number of executions in Texas was second only to Florida at that point. Florida executed more people than any other state. And so it was a kind of political issue at the time. I don't really know what it's like now. But, you know, again, being in that room with these gigantic photographs of prisons was really, it taught me something about scale, which is that looking at a really big photograph is just different from looking at a small photograph in a frame like these behind me. You know, whether it's better or worse depends on the subject matter, I think. So one more slide here, or 2 more. Okay, so one thing I thought would be interesting to do is just, if this were an in-person class, we would just talk about this abstract painting and about whether its composition works, whether its design works in terms of all the things we've talked about. Unity and variety, emphasis and subordination, balance and symmetry, asymmetry, scale. Well, it's big. The slide is supposed to show you how big. It's on the wall back here, but all of her paintings are big. They're about as tall as she is. Okay, so since there's only a few people here, we can postpone this discussion until Friday, and maybe you can come up with an idea or a question about this painting. Now, the title is French. It says Le Puits Noir, and it's an allusion to a 19th century French painting called by Courbet called Le Puits Noir, which was the dark ravine. So she's making a reference to a landscape painting by Courbet, which was not abstract. I mean, does this look like a landscape? I don't know. But she's referring to that in the title. So maybe you can think of a question or comment about this painting to discuss with other students on Friday. Or if you can't come to that discussion, you can just write a great discussion question about it for us to discuss. Or some of these other things that we looked at today. So, or on Monday. So the idea